All right, guys, welcome back. This is part two of lesson two, the Abbasid Dynasty in the Arab world. So we're going to jump right into the changing role of women during this particular time period. Now, historians really don't have a lot of information about the role that women played in the Abbasid dynasty, simply because their rights changed and most of the writing done about women was done by men who were essentially writing to tell women how to behave. So under the Abbasid period, we definitely see an increase in the patriarchal society that seems to dominate the rest of the world at this time. This is in contrast to the lives that women led under the teachings of Muhammad. So some of the things that happened during the Abbasid period change the way that Muslims interpret the Quran and the message of the Quran. We're going to see during this time period, thanks to trade, there's going to be an increasing demand for slaves, both male and female, especially as elite members of society gain more and more wealth. We're going to see the incorporation of something called the harem, which was basically a way for caliphs and elite males to have access to multiple wives. These harems could contain anywhere from 10 to 100 women, and they were usually guarded by men called eunuchs, who were special workers who prided themselves on not being desirable to women or desiring women. If you really want to learn a little bit more about them, you can look up the definition yourself. One of the other changes that we're going to see in this time period is the incorporation of more Byzantine and Persian practices of having women be veiled or secluded away or segregated from men. This is really going to affect upper class women. And we'll especially see this in the arrangement of marriages start to take place where women are being married off as young as 9 years old. And the men are usually much older than these women, although marital relations usually don't start until the girl is a little bit older. A lot of those marriages were political. Women in this time period also lose access to a lot of the career opportunities that they had in the Umayyad period. Women in these harems, the only way that they could gain any kind of status was to bear sons, and then these women spent much of their lives plotting to put their son into a position where they could inherit the caliphate or hold positions of authority within the government. Life for lower class women was a little bit different. They still tended to have more freedoms, and even slaves had more freedoms than the women in the upper class. Women in the lower classes still had to work in fields, still held skilled working positions. And you can see here from this excerpt from Nabia Abbott, who is a historian about the Abbasid Caliph, and she kind of describes the lives of the harem women. So if you want to pause me for a second and read that, it's kind of interesting. And as I mentioned before, this is sort of the flourishing of the slave trade. This image that you see right here would be a harem room. And of course, the woman that you see there is veiled. And we'll look at that in a little more. So here's like an image of a lower class woman actually working in the fields. So why this started to change, and we still see the effects of this change in the modern world. So what you're seeing here is a chart that's kind of describing the use of veiling throughout the Middle East and the different styles of veil, from the hijab, which is all the way there to the right, which is kind of the most common one that you see. It's just the covering of the hair, all the way to the burqa, which is a much more modest garment worn by women where only the eyes can be seen. And, even though the Quran, encourages female modesty, there's nothing in the Quran about the veiling of women. This is just a tradition that began as Persian and Byzantine practices made their way into the Muslim world. This is a really kind of cool clip. So if you want to pause me, and you can go into the resources and you can actually watch this clip in which American Muslim woman explains why she wears the veil. It's actually really interesting. All right, moving on. Oops, we're going to skip that and go on. One of the most important caliphs of the Abbasid dynasty is this man by the name of Harun al-Rashid. He's considered to be the fifth Abbasid caliph, and you can see him sitting there. And you actually see in this image, if you look at the two people that are kneeling in front of him, those are actually emissaries from Charlemagne. So King Charlemagne of the Franks sends emissaries to the Abbasid dynasty, and the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid sends actually gifts back to Charlemagne in return, including things like an elephant, which they had never seen in that particular part of the world. All right, so who is this guy? He is one of the important caliphs because he's the one that really begins the patronage of the arts and the sciences. He actually helps to establish the Bat al-Hikima, or the House of Wisdom. This is like the eminent scholarly domain of this time period. And if so, two important things are going to happen in this. We'll talk about in the next slide. But he becomes so famous, and his lifestyle becomes so lavish that it is believed that his life and experiences are the basis of some of the stories in 1001 Arabian Nights. And you actually know these stories: Aladdin and his magic lamp, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. All of these tales were told by a woman by the name of Scheherazade, who was trying to save her own life by telling her husband fantastical stories every night. And for 3 years, every night she told him a story that ended in a cliffhanger. And after bearing him 3 children, he finally says, okay, I'm not going to end your life. He was worried about his wife cheating on him. Again, I put another video in the resources if you want to learn a little bit more about this particular situation. Okay. So here's a little excerpt from the 1001 Arabian Nights. Again, you can pause it, read it, just kind of incorporate it. And there's an image of Scheherazade telling her husband all of these fantastical stories. So now Harun al-Rashid is important because of his patronage for the arts and sciences, and he is credited with bringing about the golden age of the Arabs. So what happened during this time period? We see 2 incredibly intense periods of scholarship emerging in the city of Baghdad. The first one is this efforts of translation. So texts from all over the world were brought in to Baghdad to be translated into Arabic. This is going to be really, really important because as the Western world is in its period of decline, it is the Arabs who are going to preserve a lot of the knowledge of the ancient Greeks and Romans. Many of these great works of art we have today because of the efforts of Harun al-Rashid. In another aspect of this was what we call original scholarship. So this means that the caliphs funded exploration into arts and sciences, everything that you could possibly imagine: math, medicine, astronomy, physics, all of these wonderful periods of just learning and knowledge. And so much of what we have today comes from this. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that the more that Islam restricted depicting human forms, the greater the rise of the art of calligraphy. And so much of the work done in both these 2 schools of scholarship, in translation and original, was done in scholarship. It also fueled literacy in this time period, at least among the men. And the image you see down here is a pretty famous one. You can see a bunch of Islamic scholars or scholars from all over the world, sitting down and discussing, math and science. Here's just a slide that shows you some of the amazing things that came out of this time period. Math. It's during this time period that the number system from the Gupta Empire was brought over, becoming known as the Arabic numbers. We see improvements in science, the invention of things like algebra and trigonometry and geometry. One of these scientists actually figured out how the human eye worked. And all of this was capable because of the Battle of Talis that happened in 751. With the introduction of paper making, the ability to reproduce books becomes essential to the preservation and spread of all of this knowledge. And we also see Islamic scholars begin to delve into cartography, which is making maps of the world. Just like all things, they all must come to an end. And much like the Umayyad dynasty, the Abbasid dynasty also had its own share of struggles. We really start to see the decline of the Abbasids starting in the 9th century. So even though the empire survives well into the mid-1200s, the 9th century, it's very similar to the 3rd century crisis of the Roman Empire. And we see a lot of similar characteristics. So for example, unstable government. Once Harun al-Rashid dies, there's a frequent assassination of the caliphs, and the caliphs begin to isolate themselves from their people, where they will speak through a vizier or a wazir. And so we really don't see the caliphs kind of almost become puppets of their own governments. Harun al-Rashid's older sons end up having a fight that destroys a lot of Baghdad. We start to see this gap between the rich and the poor also begin to develop. People are buying positions instead of earning them. Huge taxes in order to fund the lifestyles of these wealthy caliphs. Public works start to be ignored. Irrigation systems fall into disrepair. Cities are abandoned. It just is a mess. We start to see revolts among peasants and slaves. We also start to see revolts among some non-Arab groups. So for example, like Turkish slaves, the Mamluks are actually going to play a huge role in overthrowing parts of the Abbasid dynasty. And we also see, like the Umayyad dynasty, moral corruption. All of the things that were kind of valued by the caliphs, these large harems and divorce and consuming alcohol, all of these things are forbidden by Islamic law. And so many, especially in the Persian area, many of these Persian Arabs look upon the Abbasid caliphs as being morally corrupt. We also see the use of non-Arab mercenary armies. And these armies are going to start to outnumber the Arab armies. And so they're going to work their way into key military and political positions and use those positions to undermine the authority of the caliph. And we're also going to see a lot of external pressures, just like in the western half of the Roman Empire. The Seljuk Turks in 1055 are going to cause some problems. And finally, the Mongols in 1258 will bring about the end of this period. So this slide here just sort of explains the different groups and the roles that they're going to play in the decline of the Abbasid Empire. So again, you can pause me here, read through this. It talks about the Mamluks. It talks about the Delhi Sultanate. It talks about the Crusaders, who we'll learn a little bit more about. And it also kind of gives mention to the Mongols. So here's what's going to happen. And this is like a great little summary. So I'm just going to read this to you guys. During the 10th century, Abbasid rule over the Islamic world started to fracture. Egypt and other North African countries, as well as the Caliphate in southern Spain, asserted their independence from the Abbasid. The empire was losing political authority. Only spiritual and cultural leadership remained, which the Abbasids managed to hold on to until the Mongols ended the Abbasid Empire in 1258 when they took control of Baghdad. So this is actually going to get hidden once I cycle through this slide, but I did put it into the notes at the bottom if you want to look it over. All right, so at this point, the only thing that's uniting the Abbasid Empire is the bonds of Islam and the Arabic language. Spain, 750, had never really been a part of the Abbasid Empire, rather was an independent caliphate. It was the last kind of stronghold of the Umayyad dynasty. In 780, Morocco, which is located in the northern tip of Africa, close to the Atlantic Ocean, breaks away. In 945, a group of non-Arab Muslims called the Boyads capture capture Baghdad in 945, and they're the ones that really reduce the Abbasid Caliph to a puppet. So behind the scenes, the viziers are members of this Bayad kind of dynasty. In 973, the Egyptian Fatimids break away. Fatimid is actually considered a descendant of, I believe, Ali. And the Fatimids actually hire a group of mercenaries known as the Seljuk Turks to sort of fight for them. That's going to come back and bite them later. These Turks are skilled archers, skilled warriors. They're from like Armenia and Iran. And then in 1055, the Seljuk Turks actually defeat the Buyids and establish what is the Ottoman Empire. This empire is going to last until 1919, the end of World War I. The Byzantine Empire will continue to fight off challenges from the Turks, and it's going to be the Turks' capture of the city of Jerusalem that will eventually spark the Crusades, which is a series of holy wars between Christians and Muslims that take place in the 11th and 12th centuries. And we'll learn a little bit more about that later. Okay, so here is the Buyid dynasty. So you can see that lasted for only about 100 years or so. And then here we have the empire of the Seljuk Turks around 1100. It is the Seljuk Turks that are eventually going to take out the Byzantine Empire. But the real end of the Abbasid dynasty comes at the hands of the Mongols. And again, we're going to learn more about them a little bit later. And the images that you're seeing here are really just showing you the Abbasid illustration of the destruction of the city. So you see the Mongols there at the bottom. You can actually check this out. Look at all the siege weapons you see the Mongols have, right? You see archers down here on the bottom, right? You see them over here. You see them kind of invading and getting into the cities. You see people sort of hiding, running scared. Look at the siege engine here. This is actually a catapult, right? So the Mongols are notorious for using the technology of the people they conquer against them. And as one writer put it, the Muslims were known for their destruction of the city. So while the Muslims built cities, the Mongols destroyed them. And wherever the Mongols are going to go, they actually always give the rulers a chance to surrender, and become basically part of the Mongol Empire. Now remember, the Mongols ruled with hegemony, so they would allow the Muslim leaders to keep their position, keep their religion, but they had to pay taxes and tribute. The last caliph of the Abbasid Empire wasn't really, I guess, the smartest tool in the shed. Even though he was essentially a figurehead, the Mongols did send an emissary to him asking him to surrender. And this was Mongoke, who was a Mongol descendant of Genghis Khan. And when the Caliph refused to not only show up in person to decline the offer, but then declined the offer, the Mongols basically came in and just wiped the city from existence, completely destroying the city of Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliph was like, oops, I made a mistake. I changed my mind, but you only get one chance with the Mongols. And so this is going to bring about the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. All right, that pretty much ends where I'm going. But what I'm going to show you just here is the map of the world at the beginning of the Arab empires. So you can kind of take a look at this map and you can see the different civilizations that existed. This is probably around 900, this map, throughout the world. And then now take a look at the map of the world at the end of the Abbasid dynasty. And you can see here that the map has changed significantly, right? While we still see the Abbasid dynasty here, the Seljuk Turks are actually going to completely take over this particular civilization. And we also see at this point in 1200 kind of the reemergence of Europe. All right, so that leads me to the very end. One of the things that you are going to be asked to do is you're going to be asked to compare these two caliphates. So make sure you kind of go through and you understand the differences between the two civilizations. And then tomorrow or next time we see each other, we're going to be working on the golden age of the Abbasid Caliphate. And that's going to take you through kind of a little escape room. All right, guys, have a great day, and I will see you soon.